Well, good evening. Welcome to community meeting number 3 on the City of Sparks City Council Ward redistricting process for 2021. I am Armando Ornelas, the Community Services Director, and joining me to do this presentation is Jim Rundle, City Planner. We will be going through this presentation and then we will be moving into question and answer period. This is the third of 3 community meetings that the city is conducting to solicit input on the redistricting process, and in particular, any input that the public may have regarding 3 alternatives that have been developed for review and consideration by the public and ultimately the city council on alternative ward boundaries for the city. All of the info that we will be going through today, including this evening's presentation, will be posted to the website. There is a specific address that's been set up, email address. It's redistricting@cityofsparks.us, where the public can provide input to the city council and to city staff. And so with that, we will move into the presentation itself. So why redistrict? Why are we doing this in 2021? Well, the city charter requires that the city be divided into 5 wards for representation by city council members. And those wards should be as nearly as equal in population as conveniently be provided. The ward boundaries must be changed whenever the US Census shows that the population in any one ward exceeds the population in any other ward by more than 5%. Again, we have received the 2020 census data earlier this year, actually just 2 months ago in August, and we have been working to develop alternatives for consideration by the city council. So that is why we are redistricting.
Thanks, Armando. This is a very simple table depicting what the population of the city of Sparks was in 2010, as certified by the 2011 census, and what we found that the census has provided us for what our population in the city of Sparks was in the year 2020, just last year. Sparks has grown by 17,388 people for a total population of 108,445, a 19.1% increase. Well, as Armando said earlier, we have to now redistribute the population between each of those wards, 5 wards in the city of Sparks, all based on the number of residents living in those wards. I'd like to point out, if you look at Ward 1 and the difference between Ward 5. Now, on that first line, it's as if you were standing in Ward 1, looking over into Ward 5. You'll see that Ward 1 is 20.2% smaller than Ward 5. Whereas if you were standing in Ward 5, looking into Ward 1, you'll see that it's 16.8% larger than Ward 1 at 24,783 people.
So we know we have to redistrict. What are the criteria for drawing new ward boundaries? Well, the Sparks Municipal Code in Chapter 2 addresses that. And first of all, the new ward boundaries must include the block in which the incumbent city council person for that ward resides. In other words, we cannot redistrict someone out of their ward. We cannot redistrict an existing city council member out of their ward. The boundaries of wards must be contiguous. So, essentially what that means is that you cannot have the ward be divided into 2 or more parts that are not connected to each other. And whenever possible, ward boundaries must follow arterials and major streets. In addition, the Federal Voting Rights Act prohibits the use of redistricting to dilute the voting power of racial and ethnic minorities. There's also US Supreme Court case law on this matter, and it basically holds that jurisdictions need to rely primarily on traditional redistricting principles, such as the ones that are incorporated in the Sparks Municipal Code that call for compactness, contiguity, and in addition, respect for political subdivisions or shared interest communities. So for example, if the Reno Sparks Indian Colony were located inside the city of Sparks, that would call for that community to be kept intact in a single ward. Racial and ethnic considerations generally should not be the predominant factor in drawing ward lines, but they can be one of many factors, especially when if the purpose is to avoid vote dilution, they can be considered for drawing ward boundaries.
Well, city staff, we've developed 3 alternatives that meet the criteria that Armando has outlined, including making sure the council member maintains inside their ward, redistributing that population to be within 5% of each other. Again, we've developed 3 alternatives. Developing alternatives is very difficult. As you move one area to another, it begins to shift the population outside that 5%. We're trying to follow the major arterials in the city of Sparks, and again, bound by the criteria to ensure members stay within their district. So they are very difficult to come up with, but the city was successful in creating 3 different alternatives. This is the existing ward boundaries. As you can see, we have 20,624 people in Ward 1, 19,884 in Ward 2 being the smallest, with Ward 5 being the largest, 24,783. The current ward boundaries are primarily separated by Greenbrae on between Ward 1 and 2. Between wards 1 and 3, McCarran Boulevard, between Ward 2 and Ward 5, McCarran, North Truckee Lane, extended up to Sparks Galleria Parkway. And then as we go over into Ward 4 and Ward 5, Pioneer Meadows separates Wingfield Springs, with Vista Boulevard separating them to the south. And then over to the east, we have Los Altos separating Ward 3 from Ward 4. These are the existing ward demographics that the 2020 census found. What we'd like to point out here is, again, the population differences between the existing wards. Ward 2 being the smallest, 19,884 people, whereas Ward 4 has received is now 22,120 people. So again, we have to balance those populations to be within 5% of each other. This is the citywide demographics. These are what are existing in the current wards, the first, the wards that exist today. And you can see that 58% of the population in the city of Sparks is white alone, 3% Black or African American, 2% American Indian, 7% Asian alone, 1% Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander alone, 15% some other race, and 14% identifies with the population of 2 or more races. We also have that 30% of the residents of the city of Sparks identify as 30% as Hispanic or Latino, and 70% as non-Hispanic or Latino.
We will now walk you through the 3 alternatives in terms of ward boundaries. This first one, alternative number 1, the map for that is shown on the right-hand side of the screen. And some of the key changes include for Ward 1, the eastern boundary shifts eastward from McCarran to Sparks Boulevard. Ward 2 extends further east now to Howard Drive. Ward 4's southern boundary shifts north to Vista. And the southern boundary of Ward 5 shifts north to Bering Boulevard. This is essentially the same table that Jim discussed for the current ward boundaries. We've broken it up so it's a little more visible into 2 parts. This one has wards 1 through 3, And again, this is alternative 1. I'm going to focus on just that top line of total population because we will show you the demographics in a series of pie charts that make it a little more readily understood. So for Ward 1, the population as proposed by alternative 1 would increase from 2624 existing to 21661. That is an increase of 1,037 persons. The population of Ward 2 in alternative 1 would increase to 21,578 people. That is an increase of 1,694 people. Ward 3's population would increase from 21,034 to 21,381. That represents 347 additional persons. And in Ward 4, the population would decrease by 388 persons, falling from 22,120 people currently to 21,732 people. The Ward 5 population would decrease by almost 2,700 people, 2,690 specifically, and would decrease to 22,093 from an existing population of 24,783 people.
This is alternative number 2 depicted on your screen. We're going to point out a few of the key changes in the boundaries of alternative number 2. Ward 1 includes East Greenbrae now to Prater Way. Ward 2 extends east to Spanish Springs Road. Ward 4, southern boundary shifts north to Vista Boulevard. And Ward 5, southern boundary shifts north to McCarran Boulevard. And then as well takes in the Stonebrook area in the north part of the city. Alternative number 2 finds that a proposed population would increase Ward 1 by 1,065 people. Ward 2 would increase by 1,334 people. Ward 3 would increase by 628 people. Whereas Ward 4 and Ward 5 would both be reduced. Ward 4 would reduce by 388 people, and Ward 5 would reduce by 2,639 people.
Here is the map for proposed alternative number 3. As you can see, Ward 1 also in this alternative also shifts eastward to Sparks Boulevard. It also, the northern boundary of Ward 1 also shifts southward to Audie Boulevard. In terms of Ward 2, it shifts south to Queen Way and then west to Probasco. The eastern boundary shifts west to Probasco. Ward 3 extends west to Probasco. And Ward 5 shifts east to Vista Boulevard, south to Bering, and north to La Posada Drive. One of the things that, I'm sorry, Casey, would you go back to the map? And we should have mentioned that this earlier. I apologize for that. In each of these maps, the colored dot in each of the wards represents the current residents of the incumbent council member for that district. In terms of the numbers, the total population numbers for each of the wards in alternative 3, the population of Ward 1 would increase from 2624 to 21,536. That represents 912 more people. Ward 2's population would increase to 21,525 people, an increase of 1,641 persons. Ward 3's population would increase from 21,034 to 21,466. That represents 432 more people. A very modest change in Ward 4 of 1 person from 22,120 to 22,121. And then the biggest change of all here is in Ward 5, where the population would decrease from the 24,783 people who are currently in that ward to 21,797 people.
These are the populations by race in Ward 1 from what is existing today to what is proposed in the three different alternatives. Existing Ward 1 as compared to Alternative 1 remains essentially unchanged with just a small 1% change between white alone. If you compare existing to Ward 2, if you compare existing Ward 1 to alternative number 2, you'll find that they are essentially the same, only a 1% change. And then again, existing Ward 1 to alternative 3 is a very small 2% change. And here we have the population by ethnicity in Ward 1. Ward 1 existing compared to alternative 1 essentially remains unchanged, a very small 1% change between existing and alternative 2 in Ward 1 is again just a 1% change, whereas a small change is found between existing Ward 1 and proposed alternative 3 with a 5% change. This is a population by race for Ward 2. The existing compared to alternative 1 is the same, whereas existing Ward 2 compared to alternative number 2 is just a 1% change, and existing Ward 2 compared to alternative number 3 for Ward 2 has a very small 2% change in the numbers. Here are the population by ethnicity for Ward 2. Existing in Ward 2, 46% Hispanic or Latino, whereas 54% identify as non-Hispanic or Latino. When compared with our existing to alternative number 1, very close numbers. When compared to alternative number 2, only a 2% swing. And when compared with existing to alternative number 3, we have another 2% swing. So very consistent numbers for the alternatives in Ward 2 regarding ethnicity.
This is the population by race for Ward 3. Again, we are showing you in the upper left-hand corner the existing ward demographics for race, and then the three alternatives. There's a theme here. There's very minor changes in these alternatives, and this is true in this case. The population that identified as white alone currently is 66%, and that varies from 64% for alternative 1 to 66% in alternative 2 and 63% in alternative 3. The most significant change other than this, that 3%, is an increase from 9% to 11% in the category of some other race alone when you compare existing to alternative 3. In terms of ethnic identification, again, pretty consistent. The existing population in Ward 3 that identifies as Hispanic or Latino is 22%. That would increase to 24% in alternative 1, 22% in alternative 2, and 25% in alternative 3. This is the population by race for Ward 4. There is essentially no change here. Starting with the white population, persons that are identified as white alone, it's 75% in the existing ward boundaries. That's also the case in alternatives 1 and 2, and that goes down by 1% to 74% in the third alternative. And in terms of ethnicity, there is no change, with 84% of the population identifying as not Hispanic or Latino and 16% identifying as Hispanic or Latino.
Now we move on to Ward 5, the last ward. that we're going to describe today. And you'll see that the existing Ward 5 has a very similar breakdown of race to proposed alternative 1, a 3% difference between the two. Whereas existing and proposed alternative number 2 is only a 1% change and a 2% difference between existing and proposed alternative 3 for Ward 5. Here we have the ethnicity in Ward 5. Existing at 25% and 75% of non-Hispanic or Latino in the 75% realm compares very similarly to alternative 1 with a 3% change, and is exactly the same in alternative 2, whereas alternative 3 and alternative 1 end up being the same with a 3% change from what is existing. And that concludes the portion of our presentation regarding the population and the race and ethnicity of the different wards. We are currently in step 2 of our redistricting process. Today, October 14th, is their third community workshop that we had planned to have. We previously held one at Sparks High School at the theater. And yesterday we held one at the Alf Sorensen Gymnasium. Where we hope to move forward from today is to gather all of the input we've received from the last 2 meetings and today's meeting and begin to prepare a staff report that will be considered by the Sparks City Council. Now, changing of the ward boundaries is done by ordinance. Ordinances require 2 hearings. We, at this point, anticipate that the first hearing would be on November 8th and would schedule a public hearing for the City Council to consider additional public input in a public hearing for a format at the City Council chambers. We're hoping at this point that could be held on November 22nd, 2021, just about a little over a month out from today.
Well, we have reached the conclusion of our formal presentation. We are available for your questions and your comments. And alternatively, again, comments may also be submitted by email to the redistricting@cityofsparks.us email address.